No matter who is speaking, the saints must discern whether or not what is spoken is according to the truth.
To recap the previous part of this series, we saw how Witness Lee teaches that there are multiple states a Christian can end up in after salvation based on how sanctified a believer may be. There are some who never get past the starting line of salvation, some who have made some progress, and the highest tier of Christian, the overcomer, who has had their entire body sanctified. Already we are at the line, if not already over the line, of Protestant Christian orthodoxy, as there is a requirement of works to avoid a certain level of punishment by God. However, when it comes to eschatology, we arrive at another level away from orthodoxy, even within a dispensational framework. With so many different outcomes for even believing Christians, an obvious question to this paradigm has to be, what happens to each of these groups, and how do I make sure I am one of these overcomers? Now, before we get into the specifics, I want to make a quick qualification. I know that I'm the king of caveats and qualifications, but I think this one is important. What I'm trying to avoid in this video is an outright criticism of dispensationalism as a whole. What I have learned in my time studying dispensationalism is that there are no two groups with the same understanding of dispensationalism. However, most have some similar qualities, like a single rapture of the whole church, a tribulation at some point, and a literal Antichrist. Witness Lee's version of dispensationalism breaks one of these trends, that being a single rapture of the church, to such a dramatic extent, and creates an eschatology that has been called unbelievable by everyone I've described it to. First difference between the Lord's recovery and normal dispensationalism has to do with the rapture. Those with a dispensational understanding of the Bible use the prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks from Daniel 9:25 through 27. Here, the weeks are divided into 62 weeks, and then 7 weeks, and then 1 week. This 1 week is 7 years long and split into 2 3.5-year periods. According to general dispensational theology, these 70 weeks of Daniel paused at week 69, which was the death of Jesus, and we are still awaiting the 70th week to happen, which will include the rapture and the tribulation. Here, we come across a major difference between the recovery and common dispensationalism, which is, when will the rapture take place? Among the average dispensationalist, you may get a different answer. Some may say before the tribulation, aka pre-trib. Some may say at the end of the first 3.5 years, aka mid-trib. And some say that at the end of the full 7 years, aka post-trib. However, according to Witness Lee and the current teachings of the Lord's recovery, there will be raptures at each of these times. During a recent message given by Menorah Chin at a conference in Southern California in 2022 entitled The Believer's Proper Attitude Toward the Coming of Christ, Message 4, he says, there are many raptures, many kinds of raptures. He goes on to say, there are the early overcomers, which I would describe as pre-trib, the late overcomers, or mid-trib, and the final harvest, post-trib. As will come out later, Witness Lee teaches there may be up to 6 different raptures, but these 3 are the ones consisting of the most believers, and as such will be the paradigm we will focus on. So what happens to those at each of these stages? For the early overcomers, it's easy. According to the teaching in the Lord's Recovery, these are the best, most spiritual Christians who are raptured before the start of the tribulation. Witness Lee says in the conclusion of the New Testament, Experiencing, Enjoying, and Expressing Christ, Volume 3, Message 411, Experiencing, Enjoying, and Expressing Christ in Revelation. Quote, "The rapture of the early overcomers, including the man-child and the first fruits, will occur at the start of the process of the Lord's coming back. In other words, when they are raptured, the process of the Lord's coming back begins." He continues, "We all must ask ourselves if we are precious and if we are worthy of being stolen by Christ in his secret coming. Suddenly, some of the believers who are the early overcomers will be taken away by the Lord's coming as a thief." Matthew 24:43. In just a minute, we will get to what members in the Lord's Recovery are told is the sign that you are one of these overcomers. But you can be sure it has a lot to do with being part of their movement. There is a saying that there will be overcomers in other Christian groups, but it is considered to be much harder than if you are in the recovery. Now that we are at the second group, the late overcomers, we have to deal with what will happen during the tribulation because, according to Lee's theology, Christians in this group are being punished by having to go through the tribulation due to their lack of spiritual growth. Lee says in the Collected Works of Witness Lee, 1994 through 1997, Volume 4, Various Meetings in Anaheim, Chapter 15, Revelation as the Completion, Conclusion, and Consummation of the Bible, quote, "Because they were not mature, they were not part of the first fruits, but rather were left in the field to ripen and mature under the bright sun of the tribulation. However, they are faithful unto death, and through the persecution of Antichrist, they become the late overcomers, standing over the glassy sea mingled with fire, which is a sign of the lake of fire." My question here, just as it would be at every point past the rapture of the early overcomers, is, what is the sin that Jesus could not cover that causes these genuine Christians to be passed over in a negative sense by God? They will be persecuted by Antichrist and possibly martyred, all because they were not mature enough. There also appears to be, in Witness Lee's theology, a third category of Christians he called the final harvest. While the late overcomers might be raptured prior to the end of the Great Tribulation, the final harvest consists of the majority of saints. I have to say that this makes a whole lot of sense considering Witness Lee's feelings toward all other Christian groups. He believes that all other Christian groups were totally devoid of the truth and spirituality. You see this all the time today, as the current group of co-workers say things like,
But the Church of God has failed. The Church of God have not been successful. Don't look at today's Christianity and compare, all right? Today's Christianity is devoid of the truth.
For this reason, most Christians have, at least eschatology, been sentenced to suffer, not only in the tribulation, but also for another 1,000 years. Unfortunately for all us normal Christians, not in the Lord's recovery, we will most likely be deemed unworthy of entering into the wedding feast as a sort of initial judgment. From there, we will suffer 1,000 years of weeping, gnashing of teeth, and what is commonly called in the recovery, dispensational discipline. I dare not go into all of Witness Lee's raptures. As it turned out in my research, Witness Lee actually taught that there will be as many as 6 raptures at some points in his ministry. However, these are more obscure and at one point only consist of 2 people. He says, in the life study of Revelation, Message 54, The Marriage of the Lamb and the Marriage Dinner, quote, there will be several raptures. The rapture of the first fruits, the rapture of the man-child, the rapture of the overcomers on the glassy sea, the rapture of the two witnesses, the rapture of the majority of the believers, and the rapture of the gleanings. The wedding of the Lamb will follow all these raptures. To most in the dispensational camp, it would be impossible for there to be multiple raptures, as the whole church, all genuine Christians, is raptured at once, either at the beginning, middle, or end of the tribulation. This is because, as I emphasized so often in the previous video, setting any threshold for entering the Lord's presence other than the holy, efficacious blood of Christ would result in every single one of us falling short of that mark. Even though there is an extremely low likelihood that this is true, we should probably figure out what it takes to be an overcomer and avoid all of the pain associated with missing out. If you have been in the church life for any significant period of time, you will have heard that these overcomers, according to Lee's reading of Revelation 14, 1-5, were without spot or wrinkle and perfect in the holiness of God, absolutely sanctified to God, and fully saturated with God. That's footnote 2 from the Recovery Version, Revelation 14:5. To anyone outside the Lord's recovery, this would seem like an impossible standard to reach. Perfect in the holiness of God, absolutely sanctified and fully saturated with God. These things aren't at all possible for someone to achieve in their lifetime. However, for us in the church life, we were told that these things were just the result of being a, quote, normal Christian. It is even stated that there will be overcomers among those who aren't in the Lord's recovery, but the best place to be an overcomer is in the Lord's recovery. So how do you become an overcomer? Well, in the same message from Menorah Chin that I mentioned earlier, The Believer's Proper Attitude Toward the Coming of Christ, Message 4, he gives some points on how to be an overcomer, based on the example of two brothers in the Lord's recovery who have gone on to be with the Lord.
Number one, his absoluteness in seeking and following the Lord and his recovery. Number two, his usefulness and faithfulness in the ministry for the Lord's recovery. Number three, his constant, unchanging oneness with the ministry. And lastly, his not caring for his own life to the uttermost.
Did you notice anything in common about nearly all of those points? Each of them would have been fine on their own, maybe with some minor adjustments. But each of them, with the exception of the last one, was directly related to being a good member in the Lord's recovery and committing to the ministry, aka Living Stream ministry. This sure sounds like only those in the recovery have a chance of being overcomers, and this is confirmed only a few minutes later in the message when he says, quote, only those like this will really be the overcomers. So what happens after everything goes down in the tribulation and Jesus comes back? Well, in Witness Lee's version of dispensational eschatology, there will be a judgment of what believers did while on earth. If you haven't done enough, you will be cast into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, commonly called in the group today dispensational discipline. A verse used as a proof text of this paradigm is 1 Corinthians 3:10-17, where building materials are judged by fire. The current leadership in the Lord's recovery says this on shepherdingwords.com. The thought of the Lord judging the believer's work appears also in 1 Corinthians 3:10-17, where we see that the true nature of every Christian's work and the Lord's evaluation of it will be revealed by fire. Those whose work is consumed will still be saved, yet so as through fire. This indicates that though the believers are eternally saved, the Lord will discipline those whose work is judged to be worthless. This is a somber warning. As we have seen already in this series, context is so important. A great rule of thumb as a Christian is never read a Bible verse. This doesn't mean don't read the Bible. Rather, to always read more of the Bible than the verse that someone is trying to use. In the case of 1 Corinthians 3:10-17, we have just come out of the section in which Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth, and that you are God's building. The context is the building of the church and how teachings impact that building. So what about the burning up by fire all the work that some have done? Rather than this being something for a Christian to worry about, this is something for us to find joy and hope in. It is possible to be a true Christian and for various reasons have a distorted view of some truth in the Bible and actually mislead the church with those teachings that are not fully biblical and be saved. Those teachers will be saved. According to 1 Corinthians 3:15, though their work will be burnt up, or at least part of it will be burnt up. We should be thankful. Oh my goodness, think of it. Think of all the denominational differences among us. Think of inside our denominations, how many ways we interpret Scripture sometimes, and how many different things we view. If we had to be flawless and perfect in our teaching, pastors, small group leaders, parents, in order to be truly Christian, there'd be no hope, right? God is merciful and willing to forgive. I'm tempted to point out all the errors other people make instead of me. I'm sure we're all going to have our knuckles rapped significantly by the Lord that we couldn't see more clearly in the Bible. But not every mistake is a damning mistake. End quote. How much more hopeful is this? Rather than doctrinal differences resulting in 1,000 years of judgment, as Witness Lee and the current Lord's Recovery leadership suggest, Christ, the foundation of the church, will destroy all the teachings that cause these divisions. This includes all the things taught by Witness Lee, and all that remains will be truth. The writers of the Shepherding Words article say that this indicates that though the believers are eternally saved, the Lord will discipline those whose work is judged to be worthless. This is a somber warning. There is no evidence that the person themselves will be disciplined for these works, only that the unworthy works will be destroyed. Paul goes out of his way in verse 15 to say that he himself will be saved. The works are not the person. Verses 16 and 17 say, do you not know that you are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. This doesn't mean that we don't contend for the truth, as we should always be striving for a more fullness of understanding of God. There's also a warning to everyone who claims to speak for God. When you try to think through what it really means that the works are burnt up, it seems likely to me that this refers not just to a false teaching being exposed and excluded from heaven, but it says in 1 Corinthians 3:14 that the teacher's work will be burnt up. That is, he's built something with his teaching, and what he's built may just go poof in the judgment. The things he thought he had constructed with teachings will be found to be worthless. It is so important for a believer to have a fear of the Lord, but it is also important for a believer to know that they are truly saved from all judgment by the blood of Christ, being constantly introspective as to whether they're doing enough for God, is extremely harmful to a believer being able to enjoy the peace that Christ provides. Why CRI relegated the implications of Witness Lee's eschatology to a single sentence, to me, is unacceptable, especially considering that the conclusion of their article was that the recovery should be seen as orthodox. With all this said, how should we, as former recovery members or questioning prospective members, proceed? We will conclude with this final quote from Piper. The final upshot of this text, 1 Corinthians 3, for all of us, I think, is that it's a call to teachers and learners, every Christian, to stand on the one foundation, Jesus Christ, and build ourselves and build others as living stones into a faithful, growing church where Christ dwells, and to do it with as much truth as we can see.